Okay, and thank you, Dr. Bahram, for those very comprehensive remarks. I'd like to now call on His Excellency Douglas Silliman, the US Ambassador.
Excellencies, Ministers, Dr. Mohammed Barkindo, distinguished guests, friends, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a pleasure to be with such a distinguished group today and to talk about a very important subject for the future of Iraq. But before I get to my core message, I would like to begin by congratulating all of the Iraqi security forces for their continued success against Daesh, especially in the fight in Mosul. I honor the efforts and the sacrifices of those brave Iraqis who have fought and served in this noble campaign, and the world as a whole owes Iraq and its brave citizens a debt of gratitude. Now, as we move steadily toward the defeat of ISIS, it is important for all of us to turn our attention to Iraq's future, and particularly to Iraq's economic future. By any measure, oil and gas reserves, good agricultural land, educated, resourceful people, Iraq is a wealthy country. However, the drop in oil prices in recent years has dramatically illustrated what many refer to as the oil curse. Over-reliance on a single commodity crowds out investment in other sectors of the economy. This reduces productivity, employment, and leads to an economy that is vulnerable to external shocks. And we have seen that in the past 2 years in Iraq. Low oil prices and the fight against ISIS have drained the treasury, and 50% of Iraq's population is under the age of 19. So in addition to the displaced and the soldiers from the battle against ISIS, hundreds of thousands of young Iraqis will enter the job market in the coming couple of years, and they will all need jobs. And even if oil prices rise, the oil sector is not a labor-intensive industry. Right now in Iraq, central and local governments provide about 60% of the full-time jobs to the Iraqi population. In a more diversified economy, that number should be closer to 15%, with 85% of workers engaged in productive private sector activity in factories, farms, services, or commerce, building additional wealth for the country. But Iraq's private sector is not a strong creator of the jobs that Iraq needs. Iraq currently ranks 165th out of 190 countries on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business survey. Why is this ranking so low? Much of it has to do with bloated bureaucracy and excessive red tape. Let me give you one example. A senior Iraqi official told me that as recently as 2 years ago, an Iraqi company that wanted to purchase land for a business was required to get 150 signatures before the approval. And this official said that he personally had to sign that approval 10 separate times at 10 different points in the approval process. Now, he relayed to me with some pride that over the past 2 years that has been reduced to only 75 signatures, but he admitted that that was still too many. So, to meet Iraq's economic challenges, Iraqi leaders must adopt a new economic paradigm based on economic diversification and private sector development. You heard His Excellency the Prime Minister, His Excellency the Speaker of the Council of Representatives talk about that this morning. The need to use oil to create a more diversified economy. Iraq must encourage both foreign and domestic investment and help entrepreneurial Iraqis start new businesses that can create new jobs. Now, the government has made a good start. The Prime Minister's focus on decentralization, good governance, simplification of regulations, and anti-corruption are a big part of the solution. And yes, as the Prime Minister mentioned, corruption remains an issue. But corruption can be addressed not only through vigorous enforcement, but more importantly, through simple, transparent regulations, modern information systems, and independent audits which together will reduce the opportunities for corrupt activity. Now, while oil can sometimes be a curse, Iraq's oil resources and a wise, coherent energy strategy will be the keys to the future stability, prosperity, and growth of Iraq. Because without adequate power and fuel, underserved and liberated communities will not be rebuilt, factories will not produce new jobs, and people will not even be able to heat and cool their homes or refrigerate their food. Current demand for electricity in Iraq is almost twice the current supply, and demand will continue to rise as Iraq's economy begins to pick up in the coming years. And now that ISIS is in retreat, the government needs to prioritize both broader economic reform and energy sector reform. On the energy side, this should include reduction of energy subsidies and drafting and implementing an integrated energy policy. By some estimates, fuel and power subsidies cost the government of Iraq $8 billion per year. What is worse, these subsidies promote overuse and waste of this very crucial resource. Iraq must move toward eliminating power and fuel subsidies and encouraging private investment in energy. And again, decentralization, simplification of regulations, and enhancing transparency will help that. Iraq must also develop a holistic and integrated energy plan for the future, one that matches fuel mix and supply with generation, transmission, and distribution capacity for electricity, for example. Currently, Iraq has unused and underutilized generation capacity due to a shortage of the availability of natural gas. Our energy experts estimate that Iraq could increase power supply by as much as 40% with an adequate supply of natural gas. But at least 45% of Iraq's natural gas is still flared and wasted. We applaud Minister Al-Luabi's emphasis on developing and monetizing Iraq's natural gas resources. Now, in the interest of brevity, I'm giving you one example of reforms that need to move forward, but one of the things that I would challenge this forum to do is to look at what Iraq's integrated energy strategy must look like. What are the key elements that will push Iraq's economy into the future and support those underlying economic goals of decentralization, deregulation, and expansion of the private sector? Now, we know that reforms are never easy. There are always vested interests in the status quo that can place obstacles in the way of reform, but even small reforms can have a significant impact. On a visit to Washington last week, Prime Minister Abadi highlighted the opportunities for the international private sector in Iraq's economy. The United States wants to be part of the future of Iraq's economy, and we at the embassy stand ready to help American and Iraqi businesses and government to find productive ways to connect and to cooperate. And in this way, we hope to help improve the economic outlook for all Iraqis. Shukran jazilan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that positive outlook on reform in Iraq. And finally, I'd like to turn to Alan Eyre from the NGO representative at the US State Department.
Your Excellencies, honored ministers, distinguished guests, good morning. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to be here today, especially on such a distinguished panel. Before talking about today's topic, energy, I'd like to echo Ambassador Silliman's comments and start by commending the success of and honoring the sacrifice of the Iraqi security forces. Their relentless march to liberate the Iraqi people and territory from ISIS is a heroic effort that is generating optimism and inspiration around the world. Building on the military success of the Iraqi security forces and the support of the US-led international coalition, events such as the Iraq Energy Forum also helped defeat ISIS by undermining the terrorist narrative beyond the battlefield. To that end, I'd like to thank Dr. Louay Al-Khatib for reconvening the Iraq Energy Forum here in Baghdad. This event is long overdue, and I'm pleased to see such a strong showing, especially by the US companies that are here. I'd also like to thank my old friend Robin Mills for moderating this session and the other panelists for their very insightful comments. Regarding energy, we are in the early days of an administration focused on strengthening the US energy sector. I know many of you are interested to hear what this focus means for industry and for our relationships around the world. As the director for the Middle East and Asia at the State Department's Energy Bureau, my team helps US foreign policy on these issues, and I'd like to take a few moments to share our perspective. While the new administration is making adjustments at home, including last week's Energy Independence Executive Order by President Trump, the United States remains committed to working with our friends and allies to achieve our collective energy and broader economic policy goals here in the Middle East and throughout the world. In this regard, it should come as no surprise that cooperation on energy was one of the key topics of discussion between President Trump and Prime Minister Abadi during their meetings in Washington, D.C. last month. Working together, we have great opportunities to enhance global energy security, to promote modern and efficient energy infrastructure, to ensure that markets remain open for greater trade and investment, and to promote energy-related employment. And what is happening in the United States, the shale revolution, is enabling our country to have a more significant effect on global energy. These early days of a new administration provide an opportune time to reflect on how rapidly the US energy landscape has evolved over the last few years, and how the US energy sector will continue improving under President Trump. Look at what has happened and is happening today in the United States. As the price of WTI dug out from 2016 lows and began to approach $50 per barrel, US production rebounded. Since July 2016, US crude oil production is up 700,000 barrels per day, with 450,000 barrels per day coming online since November 2016. But one cannot overlook that US commercial oil stocks alone are at an all-time high of 540 million barrels, or 135 million barrels above the 5-year average. Although the global oil market was beginning to rebalance on its own, the recent OPEC agreement indicates that for some OPEC countries, the market was not balancing quickly enough. Accordingly, at the end of 2016, OPEC member countries agreed to cut 1.2 million barrels per day, and now all eyes are focused on OPEC compliance with the deal. Further complicating the picture is the inclusion of non-OPEC countries in the deal, primarily Russia, where compliance is less likely. But regardless of overall compliance, in the age of the US energy revolution, to a large extent, OPEC's efforts bump up against market fundamentals. We've been saying this for some time. The more success OPEC has in complying with its November deal, the more it ensures U.S. production bounces back, taking a bite out of OPEC's market share. Many OPEC countries thought U.S. shale set a floor price for oil. In fact, what we see today is that U.S. production may, in fact, set a near-term ceiling price. In other words, shale is the new ceiling because U.S. production responds to price challenges quickly. As prices rise, more U.S. production comes online, which in turn keeps prices low. On the demand side of the global oil market, many analysts are now talking about Chinese strategic petroleum reserve purchases serving as a floor. When prices drop below a certain level, Chinese buyers can take advantage of the discount, propping up prices. With U.S. production and Chinese demand possibly creating an envelope for global oil prices, we may find ourselves in a market constrained in large part by fundamentals rather than by politics, which is good for producers and for consumers. Even as the U.S. oil patch adjusts to new market realities, new technologies and innovative practices are allowing producers to keep overall costs down and in many cases continue production levels. The United States is producing about 9.15 million barrels a day. Now that's below a four-decade high of 9.6 million barrels a day reached in 2015, but well above the 5 million barrels a day the United States was producing a decade ago. Now that the U.S. no longer has export restrictions, today's oil prices should no longer be considered low. Rather, after more than 2 years at the current levels, today's prices are the new normal. Accordingly, today's oil markets put OPEC in a different role compared to 20 or 30 years ago. From the geopolitical perspective, the OPEC deal pressures certain countries, such as Iraq, into limiting their production. Meanwhile, the United States supports increasing Iraqi revenues through ramping up production and exports. We know that Libya and Nigeria were exempt from the OPEC agreement, but Iraq too cannot afford to hold back on generating revenue. Revenue generated from Iraq's oil exports is crucial to defeating ISIS, while also providing aid to displaced communities. As we discussed earlier this week in Copenhagen, during the Counter-ISIS Finance Working Group, Iraqi hydrocarbon revenue is the foundation for providing basic services, generating economic development of liberated areas, and improving the lives of all Iraqis. For the moment, the Iraqi economy is underpinned by reliance on oil revenues, and the United States supports efforts to increase Iraqi production for the benefit of all Iraqis. In this regard, I'd like to reiterate Ambassador Silliman's message that Iraq provides clear opportunities for commercial interests and for economic investment. This is particularly true for U.S. companies, large and small. Large U.S. firms are already active in all facets of Iraq's energy sector across the country, producing oil, generating power, and overall helping to improve the everyday lives of all Iraqis. Yet more companies are looking for opportunity. There are mid-sized U.S. firms from Texas and elsewhere in the U.S. who are at this forum because they know Iraq's potential. These firms developed and optimized oil production, gas capture, and power generation technology on thin margins as part of the U.S. shale revolution. U.S. companies are ready to bring highly efficient and cost-effective technology and business models from the U.S. shale revolution to Iraq. Without a doubt, the best place in the world to find the technology, efficiency, and ability to maximize benefits from the full value of the hydrocarbon value chain is from U.S. companies. In conclusion, we at the State Department and its Bureau of Energy Affairs recognize that energy very much sits at the nexus of national security, economic development, and the future of our planet. And we help provide the expertise and the institutional knowledge to integrate energy considerations into U.S. policy. In this regard, we will continue to work with Iraq and other partners to ensure that a diversity of fuels, supply, infrastructure, and energy export routes bolster Iraq's economy and improve global energy security. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers for their tremendous contributions and their very wide-ranging discussion. And thank you to the audience for your attention. And we'll now move to a short coffee break.